Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Class 100, which will be the last class in this section of our course. I say this section because I'm thinking of a couple of possibilities that I've mentioned before that are distinct from what we've been doing, which began in 2 months, it'll be 3 years that we began with class number 1, as we traced the Abrahamic religions and concluded with examining in some detail the Baha'i Faith and some of the major events in the life of Baha'u'llah and the progress of the faith, as well as some of the major texts of the faith. And we have concluded by going over some of my particular works on the faith that I thought worth sharing. I had intended originally to do the works, the most recent works, which are largely on poetry. But I realized when I did my class last week on Robert Hayden that attempting to describe a book of poetry is without simply going over the poems is impossible, and it takes a good class to do a decent job with a single poem. So I thought what I might do in the future, and I'm considering this and would appreciate any feedback you have, of going over the general tenor of some of the, particularly the translations, the 4 books translating the poetry of Tahirih, which I'll discuss tonight in general, and precede those classes with a couple of classes discussing how one reads poetry. This would be not that people aren't capable of figuring it out on their own, but it helps when you have some clues about some of the things to look for in a poem and what to do when you read a poem and you just don't get it. You don't understand what's going on. What do you do? Just read it over and over? Well, sometimes that can help, but not always sufficiently. So we may do that. And then another possibility for future courses after we take a break will be something that was discussed by the suggestions in our Q&A several weeks ago, that we do just an open discussion, more of a fireside discussion, where we talk about subjects that you submit prior to the class. So if you have any thoughts on either or both of those possible subjects for a later Zoom class, let me know. As I said last week, right now I am working on a book, which I will mention in a moment. And that's going to take enough time where I need to take a break from preparing the weekly Zoom classes on the Baha'i Faith. And I think this is a good place to stop. So let me share my screen, and we will start the slides that for this last class, which is a conclusion, an overview of remaining works by John S. Hatcher. As I say, some of these we may discuss as we go through the poetry, and some of them I'll just tell you what they're about, and that's sufficient rather than trying to go over them in detail as I have some of the previous books. So why are we stopping or pausing now? Well, of course, as I said, one reason is that I need to dedicate my time to this book I'm working on. And also, I just need a break to assess what is the best road to take now that we have done a very decent survey of the Baha'i teachings in the Baha'i Faith. What have we accomplished in this almost 3 years? Well, we have 100 classes. and 3 years of discourse in those classes. And so, as I said, the future possibilities might be an informal discussion where we go over topics that you suggest, and the other, and we could do both if it works out to be worthwhile, on how to read poetry and using some of the poetry that I have written, that others have written, that are explicitly either about the Baha'i Faith, or in the case of the poetry of Tahirih, about the Bab and the Baha'i Faith, though she also discusses Baha'u'llah, clearly recognizes Baha'u'llah, and many of her poems are dedicated to what will become the second trumpet blast as foretold in the Quran. The first book of poetry that I published was in 1990, some 33 years ago, consists of 92 poems. And this book is a sequence of poems, really. It's divided into a number of sections, but they're dealing with different kinds of history. And so the idea of a sense of history is a sense of how all of our histories ultimately intermingle and coalesce into a single history. And so some, as you can see on the cover, which my daughter skillfully drew from an old photograph of me standing on the doorsteps of my mother's home in Commerce, Georgia, when I was 5 years old, and had great dreams of being a soldier, as you can see me saluting with my rifle, my toy rifle on my back. So it begins with the concept of history, goes through personal history, and that is lyric poems about my own life, reflections on the events in my life. A whole section is dedicated to poems that I devised from letters written to by my great-grandfather, who fought in the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, and including the Battle of Atlanta and the Battle of Chattanooga, and the Battle of Franklin and the Battle of Nashville, and so on. And he fortunately survived that, even though he was 36 and had, I think he had all 4 of his children at that point. And so the letters back and forth are touching. I don't have the letters from his wife to him, but he quotes them, what she said, and is responding to her. And it's an incredible view of what it was like to be in any war, but particularly that war where you're fighting against your own citizenry. And he talks about these things. It's available still from Amazon in both hardbound and paperback. And there's the link where you can order it if you wish it. This is a book that is not published and never will be. It was interesting, and I'm not, the reason I put it here is not to tantalize you, but because there's an interesting history behind this. This is a collection that my co-translator, Amrollah Hemmat, and his brother, Untitled Chapter, all 3 of us joined together to translate the most important poems of Baha'u'llah, some of which are quite long. So this is several hundred pages long, and was extremely difficult. It took us 4 years to do. And so naively, we wrote to the House of Justice to see if it was all right if we published this. And they said no, because that we could show them to others, or they could be put in an article, as long as it was, they were published individually and it was clear that they were not authorized translations. But what they said, and what we should have realized from the beginning, is how do you distinguish between the revealed verses of Baha'u'llah, such as the Tablet of the Holy Mariner or the hidden words, my goodness, the hidden words of poetry, and these specific works that are written in, one's a Masnavi, for example, a very long narrative poem. But there are beautiful works. The Ode of the Dove is another quite beautiful. So we were told, needless to say, that the authorization, the authoritative translation of these poems would have to go through the same process as any other translations of Baha'u'llah's works. Nevertheless, we learned a great deal and enjoyed very much doing this. And I include on my website, johnShatcher.com, one of those poems. This book is the first book of translating the poetry of Tahirih that Amrollah Hemmat and I did in 2002. This was our first idea of taking the more popular poems of Tahirih, some of the more shorter lyric poems, lyric both in style and in subject matter, and that is a lyric poem generally focuses on one very specific topic. These are very interesting poems. She has one, for example, to the Shah, Nasiruddin Shah, who had told her that if she would agree to be one of his wives, that she would not be executed. And she writes this poem in response, which shames him so beautifully that I would love to go over that with you sometime. Some of her others in this collection are in the mystic vein, particularly of the utilization of the cupbearer and the odes to the beloved in this case being the Bab, though they're written in the style of a love sonnet, or not a sonnet, a love lyric, and utilize the imagery of a love lyric. So these are some of the shorter poems that were available to us at the time. After that, 2 years later, we came out with some 50 poems from 2 different sections in Baha'i history. These are poems that, well, I didn't say that this is available through George Ronald and through Amazon, not through the Publishing Trust, but through George Ronald and Amazon. And those are the links for that book. It's easy reading. You would enjoy that. These are poems also that are easy to read. They are poems from 2 different, there are about or by, there are about martyrdom or by those Baha'is who were martyred. And the title, Reunion with the Beloved, Poetry and Martyrdom. Reunion with the Beloved is the title of the poem by former House member Fatih, and it's a lovely poem. It's the last poem in the volume. So the 2 parts of this, it's divided in half, are the poems by Varka, by Ruhollah, his son, and by others who were martyred who happened to be writers and poets. And then the second section is about or by more recent martyrs in the faith, those who have been executed since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. This book is available through Juxta Publishing or through Amazon. So these are pretty easy to read, and they're not in the first part. The first poems from the early stages of the martyrdom of the Baha'is in the latter part of the 19th century are in a traditional Persian poetic style. The modern ones are in a looser form, not such a formal form. The next thing we discovered was a manuscript, an original manuscript that was either in the hand of Tahirih or by someone copying one of her manuscripts. So it includes, as we do in all of our translations of Tahirih's work, the original in Persian and Arabic. Most of her poems are in Persian, but she'll have a lot of Arabic phrases and lines and allusions. And this we were fortunate to get from a scholar in Canada who had a copy of this original manuscript. And so the part of the book, which we put in the back, because Persian, of course, reads from right to left. And so the first page in Persian is the last page of the book and goes towards the middle. So that part is actually a scanning of the original calligraphy, and quite beautifully done. Adam's Wish is the title, the Unknown Poetry, and we say Unknown Poetry as a subtitle in these books. This is the first of three of these from three different manuscripts we came upon or were given to us by divine ordination of some sort. Has to do with, as do many of the poems in these three books by Tahirih, very sophisticated and abstruse religious, spiritual concepts, most of which are taken from the Quran or from Islamic hadith, though many are her own in a rather remarkable comprehension of theology and philosophy from a Baha'i perspective. And so they're very informative, and they include an amazing number of notes, so that anything we have interpreted that's not obvious, that we put notes about the original source, and these are hard to get through, but well worth the time and the trouble. Adam's Wish itself, the title, is referring to a concept that does not derive from Adam as he is portrayed in Genesis, but rather as he is portrayed in the Quran. In the Quran, of course, Adam is a manifestation, and this is what Baha'is believe as well. And that he was the first manifestation in the Abrahamic line of prophets. And the sin of Adam, according to this tradition, was not eating of the tree of knowledge. We believe that's, of course, a symbolic or analogical device in Genesis. But the idea that Adam foresees the future and what is to occur with the unfolding of God's plan for planet Earth, and is anxious that it come about. He knows what his part is, but he wants it to come about immediately. He is anxious, and so that's his wish, that he could see that day, that he could experience that day, rather than simply play his particular role in that process, which, according to one interpretation, is that he discerns the essential spiritual reality underlying physical reality, that he knows the spiritual nature or spirit that inhabits and animates all created things. This book is available through the Baha'i Bookstore and through Amazon as well. So this is in 2008, as you can see, quite long, but of course, a good half of that consists of the original calligraphy. The second book it's actually the third book on Tahirih, but the second in this particular series of unknown poetry. And we say unknown because these had not been published in the original Persian, nor had it been translated. And so it literally had been unknown. But this was another manuscript from the same source. And so the original calligraphy is included in this as well, about the same length, and somewhat the same subjects, very philosophically oriented, very, I wouldn't want to say difficult. The quickening itself, the title is alluding to the resurrection, the second coming, and so on. One of the terms used in the Quran is the quickening, which means, of course, the bringing back to life of humankind. Because you have, in this tradition of the Quran, which the Bab also alludes to, as does Tahirih, there would be two trumpet blasts. The first trumpet blast would be benumbing, would cause humankind to be overwhelmed, overcome, startled, bewildered, stupefied. The second would awaken those who were capable of being awakened and animate them with the spirit of this new revelation. And so you have that represented, of course, by the Baha'i Faith, which shocked and stunned Persia. And then you have it with the Baha'i Faith, which, of course, is the cause of the quickening of humankind. And that's the focus of these poems. They are also, most of them, lengthy. They're quite varied in length. Some of them are long, some of them are not. But most of them are dealing with religious concepts rather than personal poems, as the first volume with George Ronald was more of her personal experience and so on. That's not to say there aren't many references or allusions to her own situation, her own imprisonment, her own foreknowledge of her own death, and so on. But and so there's a lot of personal allusion in it. But beyond that, the focus is not on what she is experiencing, though she prays to God in many poems that she be relieved of this suffering, even as Baha'u'llah does as well. Now we're switching kind of here. This is just the chronological sequence. This has nothing to, there's another book of poetry. But I wanted to go to the two children's books that I wrote, because these were actually the first Baha'i books I wrote. You can see the first one, Ali's Dream, was published in 1980. So that's the first book. It wasn't the first book I published was the the monograph, the Metaphorical Nature of Physical Reality. That was in 77 or 78. But a couple of years later, the book Ali's Dream was published. It had a different cover then. It's gone through a number of editions. It is what I decided when I decided I want to write about the faith was I felt, since I had two young children and I was trying to teach them the faith, there were two things I felt lacking in the way of children's literature or teaching children. One was a narrative of story of Baha'u'llah himself. And I felt this because, as being raised in the Christian church, I knew all about the life of Christ. And there were pictures of Christ, and there are all kinds of stories of Christ, and so on. And so Christ was a very intimate figure to me. And I felt that intimacy was unavailable to Baha'i children because there was no narrative that told the story of Baha'u'llah's life that was accessible to children. In fact, at that time, there wasn't one for adults. As I was working on this book, I wrote to Tahirih, who did Baal-Yuzi was working on Baha'u'llah, the King of Glory. And Tahirih was working on his 4-volume work. And so when I had questions, I would write to him, to Tahirih, to see, to answer questions or to verify some speculation I had. So I realized from my own experience in teaching literature, particularly teaching Chaucer, that the only way to do this properly was to use what's called a framing device, because this is what Chaucer does with the Canterbury Tales. It is a group of stories, but there is an overall story that frames those tales. And that is the story of the pilgrimage that the narrator, who is Chaucer, presumably, tells as they travel on foot from London to Canterbury on pilgrimage. So I thought, well, one way I could, since I couldn't have Baha'u'llah be a character per se, in other words, I couldn't just tell it directly, I had to use this indirect framing device. And so I have this young man, Ali, who is 11 at the time, and I decided to have the place of the work be in some place that would be applicable to any Baha'i in any culture or country. And so I had it take place during the time of Abdu'l-Baha's journey to America in 1911, 12, so that and have Ali being raised in Akka. And so he has this dream, and the whole book is about him trying to understand the meaning of that dream and how it applies to him. And because the main thing in the dream he wants to know is the story of Baha'u'llah. And so he asked various figures, most importantly his grandfather, Moyed, to tell him about the stories. And so the stories are in chronological order, whether they're told by Moyed or some by his mother Nahid, or some by his father, some by the grandfather of his of Neda, who is a young girl that is also in that community. So I was inspired by it to write it when I went on pilgrimage in 1972, at which time Akka and its environs, including Haifa, looked pretty much the same as it had during the time of Abdu'l-Baha. It hadn't changed much. When I returned a few years ago, nothing looked the same to me. It's beautiful. The holy places are beautiful, but they're sort of set off from and isolated from the vast change that has taken place. So that's the first thing I felt that was desperately needed for children, was a story, a narrative story about the Baha'u'llah's life. And so originally it was called Ali's Dream, the story of Baha'u'llah. There was one other thing that I want to tell you about that, and that is there were other books available for children. Stories from the Dawnbreakers was one. Hand of the Cause, Bill Sears came out with some tapes for children about stories from the Dawnbreakers and so on. But there wasn't just one place where the story was told in a more or less straightforward manner. The second book I felt that needed to be written for children was something the equivalent of Some Answered Questions. Oh, and by the way, this book is available at the Baha'i Bookstore online as well as Amazon. The original book is available in hardbound and with Kindle. There's some changes between the first edition and this most recent edition, which came out in 2014, but basically the same story. So the other book I felt needed to be written for children, or I say children, really for junior youth. Though I think adults can benefit from it as well. I know I learned a tremendous amount. It took me several years to do the research necessary to put Ali's Dream together. And in that time, I learned so much about the Baha'i history, and because I had to go to so many different sources. So I felt, as I said, there needed to be something like Some Answered Questions that dealt with the essential body of Baha'i beliefs about God, about the manifestations, and about the soul, the human soul, and so on. All the fundamental questions that Baha'u'llah deals with. And of course, I couldn't deal with all of them, but I dealt with those that I thought were most appropriate for children. And I tried, when I outlined the book, to have them come somewhat in the same order as they appear in Some Answered Questions. This, too, is a framed story for the same reason. And so Hassan is a young boy who is a cousin, 2 years younger than Ali, who comes to live in Akka with Ali and his family after his grandmother has died in Mashhad in Persia. And he lives with his grandmother because both his parents were martyred. And so his grandmother, who was not a Baha'i, was a staunch Muslim, didn't talk about it much. And so there was a darkness that was in his recollection of his parents. And needless to say, he needs healing, as the title implies. So the healing process is a process by which he gradually comes to understand why his parents got killed, for what they gave their lives, the importance of what they did, but also all the underpinning of the Baha'i beliefs that he never learned because his grandmother, as I say, was a Muslim and did not want to teach him because he was afraid that he might get killed as well. And so he comes to live, when she deceases, he comes to live with Ali and his parents. And then the main part of the story concerns the trip they take. The First World War breaks out after Abdul Baha returns. The First World War breaks out, and so he and the family, along with the other Baha'is in Akka, go to the inland towns. And in particular, they end up going, after they visit the Sea of Galilee, they go up to the village of Adasiya, which was a village that Baha'is established for the purpose of growing wheat and lentils for the populace, both the Baha'is and the populace back in Akka, who needed these food stores. And of course, if you'll remember, Abdul Baha, after the war, was awarded, became a knight of the British Empire because of his assistance to the people of Akka during this time of hardship. And so as they travel together, the stories unfold one by one, and gradually, little by little, Hassan comes to understand what it means to be a Baha'i, what Baha'is believe, and ultimately becomes reconciled when he visits Abdul Baha in the last story and discovers that his parents were heroes and will be remembered throughout history because of their sacrifice. This book that came out in 1988 is a very brief book, 59 pages. It is actually a chapter from the book, The Ocean of His Words, that I wrote, which the National Assembly felt was the first chapter was a good standalone book because it discusses, as the title implies, that the manifestation is an artist, as it were. As we discussed in other classes, though you may not remember them, the manifestation, the writings say, are the author of their own revelation. They are inspired by God. What they reveal and how they reveal it is of their own devising and their own genius. There are several passages that make that very clear. So this brief book is still available through the bookstore on Amazon. I think you will find it very rewarding and helpful. I enjoy looking at it again myself, insofar as explaining the relationship of the manifestation to the process of revelation, of revealing his utterances. The artwork on the front, by the way, was done by the wife of Bob Henderson, who, forgive me her name, I've just forgotten, but at any rate, a lovely individual and a very well-respected artist in her own right. Sparks of Fire. This is a book that will be coming out hopefully this year, if not early next year. The book is finished, but it has to go through the review process. That's something you may not be aware of, but you cannot publish a book on the Baha'i Faith if you are a Baha'i without it going through the review process. Now, what is that? This is a process instigated by the Guardian, whereby any book being published about the faith by a Baha'i must be reviewed by the National Reviewing Committee for the given country to be sure there is no misinformation or misunderstanding or flaws in the presentation, or whether intentional or unintentional. And then, so it has to go through that process, which can be very time consuming for the review committee. And then the publishing trust will publish it. So there's already a contract for it to be published. The book is finished, and hopefully it'll be out before the end of this year. What I have discussed with Nat Yogananda, who is the manager of the publishing trust, is the possibility of our dedicating either at one of the permanent schools or perhaps online, if that's not possible, or both perhaps, in a weekend or more, where Amrollah and I would go over these books, both reciting the poems, discussing the poems in all four of these books on Tahirih. Now, the Sparks of Fire is a double entendre here, in the sense that the fire, of course, can be a positive image, it can be a negative image. And in this book, it's both. The fire is, of course, the fire of hatred, but it is also the fire of love that emboldens the believers to sacrifice their lives for the faith. So this book is actually dedicated to a couple who were immolated, and not immolated, immolated, excuse me, set afire and burned as martyrs a few years back. And it's dedicated to them because of the title, but also because of the theme of the work. So this is, it feels like the last poetry of Tahirih. Very little reference to her life and tribulations, though a lot at sort of the end of a poem, she will mention herself insofar as praising God or asking God to have her leave this life and ascend to the next world, and so on. So the poems are very powerful, but as with the other two books of unknown poetry, this came to us, by the way, it was in the originally in the archives of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is in Persia. It was copied, and that copy was sent to the World Center, and we were able to get a copy of that. So the calligraphy in this is not the original calligraphy. We had someone retype it in calligraphy because the original was not readable. Very rough treatment, though it too is very interesting, that is the manuscript, because the transcriber of the manuscript has a number of notes about Tahirih and things that he knows about her, that it appears evident that he, or most probably it was a male, was familiar with her and knew her. This is the book that I told you I'm working on now. I'm also working on an article that is due to come out, but this is a follow-up thematically, in a sense, to the last book I published this past fall called The Body of God, which examines the Suri Hakel. This, however, is not about a particular work, but it's about the premise is simply this: if we know the mind of God, and we are asked to do that, Baha'u'llah says, read the verses with my eyes, meaning, in other words, as I understand it, study the verses and try to understand what I have in mind. And this is a very important dictum, if you will, or point of guidance for all translators, and that is, before you begin to translate, you must be satisfied you know the intent of what you're translating. What is the author's intent, the intended meaning? Because if you don't know that, you're just putting words down, and they may or may not represent the original. Now, you may start out in a very literalistic fashion like that, but then you rework the lines as you come to appreciate and understand what the author is getting at. And so the premise of this book is if we can appreciate what God's purpose is, what is in the mind of God in creating reality, then we can understand the structure of reality, because obviously if the structure of reality is a product of God's creativity then and God's purpose, then it will be not only possible to see how it brings that objective into reality, but precisely why it's structured in the way it is. So as we are discovering now, and that image is one of the many images from on the cover from the Webb telescope, and we're discovering, of course, more and more about the structure of the cosmos and how much more there is to learn. And so all of our prior, more simplistic concepts of the cosmos are sort of being put into question, so that more and more we're having cosmologists say, well, there really isn't a beginning as such. There's only a continuation of constant change. And there are various theories of that, which I will discuss in this book. The point of it, though, as I say, is that if we truly understand God's purpose, which is contained pretty succinctly in the hadith of the hidden treasure, that God wants to create a being that is capable of having a love relationship with him, then everything else falls into place. And we see that not only is it possible to understand how these two expressions of reality, the physical and the metaphysical, work together to bring about this process, but that it could happen in no other way. So you can say two things about it in that sense. It could happen in no other way, and needless to say, since the Creator is perfect, it is the perfect way for it to happen. So you don't just say, well, why do bad things happen to good people, and so on. You realize that because that's a necessary part of the process, if we truly understand the process and how it works in terms of God's purpose, namely to be known and loved, that we might benefit from that love. All right, friends. The last class is hereby finished, and we'll now unmute you that we can have share some ideas about what we might do in the future, or any questions you have about these books.